Good afternoon, everybody. So this video will be the first, well, it'll be the first hour of basically a 2-hour lesson. We would have covered the first hour in yesterday's lesson, which we unfortunately lost. Apologies for that, but unavoidable really in the circumstance. I'm sure you understand. So I'm recording this lesson as a catch-up lesson. So really, although you're playing it as a recording and you're at home, treat it exactly as you would if you were in school. So hopefully you've printed off the mind map and you're ready to roll, and hopefully you've stuck the mind map into the middle of either an A3 sheet of paper or 2 sheets of A4 that you've sellotaped together. I've set the counter for 1 hour. Okay, so it'll beep on my phone after 60 minutes, and then I'll just end it at whatever point we reach, because the intention is we would use 2 1-hour lessons to cover this particular topic, which is Weltpolitik and the building of a large navy from 1898 to 1914. A few shots of things that we'll be covering in the lesson. In fact, most of the shots here we'll cover in the second of the 2 lessons. A map of Africa, and we'll be looking at German colonies, which are marked in yellow, so that'll be part of it. There's a man called Admiral von Tirpitz, who was the leader of the navy building program, and the famous dreadnoughts. And of course, the central character is the Kaiser Wilhelm II, who became Kaiser in 1888. So there you are. Those are our opening shots. Okay, a few business items before we push on. Okay, so posted, actually not yesterday, he would have been, if I taught you yesterday, what I obviously meant was Thursday. Posted on Thursday on Teams. I uploaded a new YouTube video, only 12 minutes, nice and brief. You've got the link there, and on Teams, therefore, that YouTube video is giving you my analysis, my guidance on how to analyse the essay question that you've been set that you have to hand in on the 16th of December. So I'll walk and talk you through how to analyse the question. That's an important process, because I'm giving you a little bit of support, not with the planning but with the question analysis, because remember, out of the question analysis grows the plan. Purpose of question analysis is to identify the building blocks and work out what your key topic sentences are going to be. So make sure that you play that 12-minute YouTube video. There's our big picture. So as you can see, we are beginning, we have finished Depth Study 1 now. Our previous lesson was the War and Site Crisis. And this is a sort of bridging topic, the building of a large navy. We'll spend 2 lessons, as you can see there, and then we've got 1 lesson where we'll do our 3rd essay writing skills lesson, which I'm calling Taking Stock. And then we'll move into Depth Study 2. Now, this topic, the building of a large navy, is all part of that building picture that we're developing about the German economy over time. So it links to when we did about protectionism there, and obviously previously we did the lesson about reasons for 19th century industrial growth. So in a sense, it's the 3rd lesson in our developing picture of the German economy over time. Okay, I put these in because obviously I've at the moment I haven't had a chance to look at them, but you on Thursday was the deadline for you to upload the evidence of for your folder check, basically. And I just thought I'd remind you of that. There's no such thing as a perfect folder, but the type of things that I would be looking for, organisation that you're working on, your notes, etc. So there's some examples of flashcards that you could be producing for all the flipped learning tasks. The point of flipped learning, of course, is to go to the textbook and be prepared for lessons. Are your class notes well ordered? Okay, so The idea behind class notes, remember, is you have a mind map. At the end of every lesson, you should have produced either a mind map or Cornell notes. And if you do a mind map, the idea, remember, is you can fold it and then put your class notes inside the folded mind map. Are you using that checklist, okay, to tick off your additional reading and notes, your sort of supercurricular tasks? Because remember, it's the supercurricular, the reading from Carr and Lee and Evans, etc., that deepens your understanding and really does sort of put the information into your long-term memory. Are you producing fit-for-purpose notes from your from this stretch reading? So when you're reading Lee and Evans and Abrams and Clark, etc., it's not about writing loads and loads and loads of notes. It's writing purposeful notes, maybe just half a side of notes, whatever. The point is that it's about identifying useful information that you can, in the end, memorize and use to strengthen your essays when you write essays in the final exam. More examples there. These are all examples from students who sat the course in the past. And you have now submitted your first essay self-evaluation, and that'll build up over time. So that's another example of the type of notes that you're producing as an ongoing basis. Okay, so there's our mind map for this double lesson. Okay, so the hour I'm doing now, we'll see how far we get. And then the second hour we'll do next week to finish off this topic. Okay, so broadly speaking, we'll start off, much of today's lesson will be a lot of background, really, sort of recapping things we've already talked about, just getting it set in the context so you understand why this topic of Weltpolitik, world policy, and the Navy building programme is so important, how it fits into the big picture. And we'll then look at what motivated Kaiser Wilhelm II to want to build a navy. Okay, and we'll break that down into those sorts of headings: political, psychological, economic, and personal. What actually sat behind him, his own personal motivations. And then we'll look at the actual Navy building programme, the Navy League, its purpose, its method, its successors, political and military. And then we'll, very importantly, look at the outcome, the consequences. Why is this so important? This fact that this brand new, very young country in the middle of Europe, Germany, which was largely landlocked, decided to build a navy, and what impact did that have, both in terms of Germany's international position, but also in terms of domestic politics. Okay, so big topic this, and in a sense, this what this topic does is it's a linking topic that links Depth Study 1, which was about the birth of the Germany of 1871, to Depth Study 2, which is about Germany during World War One, at the beginning of the 20th century. Okay, so there's our sort of big picture. Okay, so hopefully you've already done some reading. That your flipped learning for this lesson was to look at the textbook pages 52 to 4, and as always I would say that the textbook just really gives you the basic information that would, if you really knew the information in the textbook off by heart, it would facilitate you to sort of access the sort of like lower grades. But to hit the grades B, A and A star, you've got to be doing a lot more than just read the textbook. So the supercurricular is about accessing those high grades. William Carr, there's some good information in William Carr. It's scattered across chapter 7 and chapter 8, okay, on different pages, but you've got access to both of those chapters. And then Richard Evans, The Pursuit of Power. In that book, there's a section called The Great War We All Hope For, which is part of chapter 8, The Wages of Empire, and the 6 pages there, pages 698 to 704, where you'll find some good material. Okay, so that's all stuff. It's not there on the slideshow, but the Clark is also good. The Iron Kingdom, I showed you that book. I'm still currently reading it, but I will scan the whole of that chapter actually and give you access to that, Clark Iron Kingdom. because there's some good material there. And incidentally, if you've already downloaded the slideshow for this lesson and the notes, I slightly changed the slideshow this morning before recording this video. So go back to the files area and re-download the slideshow and save the updated version of the slideshow, and likewise the notes are slightly changed. So if you've already downloaded and printed off the notes, my apologies, but go back and update that. Okay, so the introduction. Okay, this by way of an introduction, the fracturing of politics in late 19th century Germany, and we're not onto the mind map yet. So this is really about sort of just recapping some of the key points. A reminder of the timeline. I thought it's opportune just to make sure you think about timeline. Okay, so there's the Second Reich, okay, a timeline of the Second Reich. And of course, 1871, Germany was unified there at the beginning. Now, beneath the timeline, underneath, I've shown you the Kaisers, the emperors, the heads of state, basically, the monarchs of the German Empire. So as you can see, Kaiser Wilhelm I was the first emperor of this new German Empire, and he was the emperor until 1888. He was succeeded by his son, Frederick III, but Frederick III died very soon after his accession. He only was Kaiser for 99 days. So I think the important point is that the next Kaiser, who was the grandson of Kaiser Wilhelm I, because he was the son of Kaiser Frederick III, so Kaiser Wilhelm II, who became the Kaiser in 1888, was very young when he became emperor. Okay, he was 29 years old, and you'll notice, of course, that above the timeline, I've shown you the chancellors, in other words, effectively the prime ministers, the heads of government of Germany during this period. Okay, the politicians who led the imperial government, the government of the empire, appointed by the Kaisers. And of course, Bismarck was the first Kaiser, was the first chancellor, and his rule as chancellor, of course, closely corresponded to the rule of the first Kaiser Wilhelm I, and ultimately, the chancellor Bismarck, he is the head of government, okay, and the Kaiser is the head of state, and in the same way that the Queen is our head of state and the Prime Minister in Britain is the head of government. But ultimately, Kaiser Wilhelm I was able to sit back, take a back seat, and effectively let Bismarck run the country. Okay, Bismarck was a very able statesman, as we know, huge achievements. But of course, in 1888, Kaiser Wilhelm I died, and by that point Bismarck was an old man and he was the Chancellor, and Frederick III didn't last very long. And so in 1888, Kaiser Wilhelm II became Kaiser, a young man, 29 years old, and he was a very, very different type of emperor to his grandfather. He was impulsive, he wanted to take on a much more hands-on role in running the country himself. He didn't really want to just let this old man Bismarck, he was now an elderly man, just carry on holding the full reins of government. So it didn't take very long before Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm II fell out. And as you can see, therefore, Bismarck effectively resigned in 1890, okay, because of that falling out with this new young Kaiser. Okay, so just wanted to give that as the background, and there is a cartoon produced at the time, and it sort of shows Bismarck resigning. Okay, there's Bismarck on the left, and you can clearly see by the look on his face he's disgusted with this young Kaiser who's portrayed as like a little boy. I mean, he was 29 years old, but the point is this new Kaiser. There's a huge difference between a young emperor and an elderly statesman, chancellor. It simply won't work anymore. And as you can see, the sticking point was this issue of socialism, okay, which is portrayed as being an explosive issue, and that was the circumstance that caused. It was the final. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. The reason that Bismarck resigned is that Bismarck ultimately, and it's explained here, Bismarck ultimately, as you know, believed the best way to tackle the growing problem of socialism was to pass very, very fierce anti-socialist laws to sort of curb the growth of the trade unions and the growth of the social democrats. And ultimately, Bismarck hoped that in the end, if these laws were allowed to lapse and the workers went too far, that Bismarck would be able to change the German constitution, the constitution of the German Empire, and make it more authoritarian, okay? Reduce even further the powers of the Reichstag. And Bismarck believed, therefore, the best way to tackle the growth of socialism was to tackle it head on in a very repressive way, okay, to restrict the ability of the socialists to manoeuvre. But the new young Kaiser Wilhelm II had a different view. He wanted to win the love of the workers, find a way of getting the workers to like him. He wanted to woo them away from Marxism, okay, from socialism, by giving the workers concessions of some kind. And that was a sticking point between the two, and therefore in 1890 Bismarck resigned as head of government, okay? And the new chancellor was a man called Caprivi, and he lasted for 4 years, because ultimately the sort of story of Kaiser Wilhelm II's reign, and he lasted until 1918 when he resigned at the end, when he abdicated at the end of World War One. But ultimately the story of Kaiser Wilhelm II's reign is that he was a much more direct and hands-on monarch, and he very quickly tended to lose patience with his chancellors, and therefore his chancellors were either sacked or resigned, moved on, basically. Okay, so there were 4 chancellors in the reign of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Well, 5 including Bismarck. Bismarck lasted 2 years, then Caprivi, then Hohenlohe, then Bülow, and then a man called Bettmann-Hollweg, who lasted until 1917. And actually then there were further rapid change of chancellors in the last year of World War One. Okay, so that's our sort of story there. Okay, so what I've done here, and this is the bit that wasn't on the original slideshow, but I thought, and this will be very useful for the essay that you're working on at the moment, is I just wanted to sort of like weigh up for you, hence the scales, a sense of Bismarck's now gone. Okay, it's now 1890 and he's on his way out. And if you were to sort of weigh up his achievements, and in a sense that's what you're doing with your most recent essay, and clearly his great achievement arguably is he has created this new German empire. He's created a united country, and there's plenty of evidence that since 1871 he has strengthened that unity in lots of different ways. Okay, and I've done a series of bullet points here. You might want to just pause the video now and have a read through them. But what I'll do is I'll just quickly sort of talk you through some of the key points. So firstly, Bismarck has clearly, a big part of increasing German unity is that he has strengthened Prussian control over the whole of Germany. Okay, so the Prussian king is now the Kaiser of the German Empire. The national capital is Berlin. The imperial government is largely controlled by Prussians. The sort of fixed administrative apparatus of the German Empire, the civil service, the judges, the legal system, the schools, the universities, and of course the army itself were largely controlled by Prussians. Okay, so that's a major factor. And I know you could say, yes, well, Germany was really Prussia enlarged, okay? But that's the point, okay? In a sense, Prussia has expanded its tentacles and is pulling all the German areas together under its control. And that's clearly an achievement of Bismarck. And the next point, there is now a national parliament that represents all German men aged 25 plus, and in particular the lower house, the Reichstag. Okay, so that in itself is evidence of a real sense of identity. All Germans can now identify we are German, and we have a national parliament that represents us, and laws for the new German Empire cannot be passed without the approval of the Reichstag. And kind of like linked to that, because it's a constitutional point, is that really in 1871 there was widespread support within the German Empire for the fact there is now a unified country to pull them all together. And in particular, that support comes from the separate monarchs of the smaller states, okay, who voluntarily gave over to Prussia the position of being their protector, because of course Germany came into existence because the separate small German states were threatened by invaders. France in 1870-71 and Austria in 1866. So there was that recognition that we need Prussia to be sort of like the glue that's holding us all together, to make us more secure. Then Bismarck as Chancellor, of course, in the early 1870s, he really used the National Liberals as the largest party in the Reichstag to pass a series of really important laws that created greater economic unification. So a single currency, the weights and measures, the civil code, etc., that you know about. I think that's a really important point. And another point about evidence of increased unity is there was that sort of consolidation. The groups at the top of the social pyramid, the upper classes, in other words, the Prussian Junkers and the monarchs of the smaller states, etc., but the middle classes, and in particular the sort of the new elites, the industrial elites, but also the white-collar workers, the professional, educated middle classes, really rallied behind this idea of a new Germany as a good thing. And it's often called the Alliance of Steel and Rye. And we also looked at this Bismarck's policy of Germanization, the way in which the various things like flags and holiday dates and German and symbols helped strengthen German identity. Now, to some extent, that was successful as well. Okay, so you could quite easily, if you're asked in an exam to sort of like talk about how successful was Bismarck, argue a pretty concrete case, certainly in the first half of the essay, that Bismarck was very successful in really strengthening and building a strong Germany. Remember, this is a new country, a new European country, in many ways much more successful than happened in Italy. Italy was a new European country, but Italy never really emerged to become a strong, great power in the way that Germany ultimately did. But there is obviously another argument there, and this is the sort of flip side of it, okay, that ultimately Bismarck in a sense failed, and when he left office in 1890, in many ways Germany was quite a divided country. Okay, so and Bismarck would have chalked these points as failures. Okay, he had not succeeded because what Bismarck wanted was to strengthen national unity, get Germans pulling together, but in many ways he had failed. So obviously the Kulturkampf was a key point. He had failed to address the issue of the Catholics, and German Catholics, as a result of the Kulturkampf, they resisted, and they rallied behind and they formed the Catholic Centre Party, and that in a sense became a very divisive new group. Likewise, not all the middle classes rallied behind Bismarck. The lower middle classes, and they're the kind of artisans, craft workers in the countryside, small traders, shopkeepers, etc., were increasingly angry because they felt threatened by the forces of industrialization. And this new Germany that Bismarck was creating was an industrializing great power. And this social group felt alienated by the age. They were threatened by the growth of socialism. They were afraid of a socialist revolution that would take everything from them if it was successful, but they were also threatened by the growth of big business from above. Remember that diagram where we showed how the artisans were being squeezed from two directions. Then, of course, you've got this hugely important social group, the growing urban working classes, the factory workers, who are becoming numerically the biggest social group, and because they're highly concentrated in these new industrial cities, they are becoming politicized. They are starting to read political pamphlets, and the big anxiety is that they will be attracted to the writings of Karl Marx, who has spoken of social revolution and socialism. Okay, and so the growing urban working classes were likewise increasingly alienated. Okay, unhappy, and Bismarck's policies of protectionism resulted in food prices becoming very high, so they were struggling to buy food. And of course, Bismarck's anti-socialist laws of 1878 attacked the political party that represented them, the SPD, and it attacked the trade unions, etc. So the urban working classes were a bit like the Catholics, were forced into a position of opposition. And in a sense, a bit like the Catholics, it was a failure because Bismarck probably didn't need to attack them. That really, innately, the Catholics and the workers were fairly loyal to Germany, but because they were being attacked by Bismarck, because Bismarck saw them as being disloyal, they were forced into a position of opposition. So that was all, again, very decisive. So as a result, German society was arguably increasingly fractured. So on one side, you've got the upper and the middle classes, the Alliance of Steel and Rye. On the other side, you've got the urban working classes. And then you've also got the Mittelstand, who are on neither side, sort of like fighting for themselves in the middle. Other points. The new constitution, the Imperial Constitution of 1871 that created Germany, gave relatively weak power to the central government in some areas. And what it did do is it gave continued autonomy to the separate 25 states and their ruling monarchs, or three of them, remember, were city councils. And remember, it was a federal structure, so the 22 monarchs and the 22 city councils had their own governments and their own parliaments that passed their own laws on matters to do with education, for example. And very importantly, income tax on earnings, didn't go to the central government in Berlin. It went to the local state governments. So in a sense, the Kaiser's government in Berlin, the national government, its income was indirect taxation, tax on trade. And that's a very unusual situation. So therefore, in terms of budget and money, much of the wealth of the nation was controlled by the separate states. And then, of course, you've got this point about the ethnic groups. Now, in particular, the Polish citizens, they very much felt under attack. Now, for two reasons, partly because of Bismarck's trying to Germanize them, making German the compulsory language in the schools in the Polish regions of the German Empire, which were in the east, but also because many Polish citizens were, of course, Catholic. So when Bismarck was attacking Catholics as part of his Kulturkampf, he was taking on Polish Catholics as well, and in particular Polish priests were very, very resistant, and many Polish-speaking citizens of the German Empire simply saw their local priest as the person to listen to. So again, that was very divisive, and Bismarck never really succeeded and drove many Poles into a position of opposition. And likewise, Bismarck never really sort of addressed the issue of Jewish citizens. Now, Jewish citizens were German speaking, they identified with the German Empire, they were loyal to the German Empire, but there was discrimination. Legally, they had the same rights as non-Jewish Germans, the remaining Germans, but nevertheless, particularly in terms of employment and being able to access the top jobs, and in particular, they found it very, very difficult to access employment in public service like civil servants or the judiciary, the state structures. So again, they became a quite alienated group. They didn't really feel part of the new German Empire. So arguably, all of those points are evidence of ongoing division. Okay, so that's kind of like the Germany we're leaving behind now, in a sense. Bismarck is going. It's now 1890, and we're now moving into the Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm II. And really, the language, when we talk about the Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm II, we mainly talk about him. We don't really talk about his chancellors, because it was the Kaiser who was the strong personality, who was basically telling the chancellors what to do. Okay, so hopefully those diagrams there, now they're all from the previous lesson, okay, sort of capture what I've just talked about, that sort of sense of fracturing. There's the point about the middle classes and the upper classes rallying together, and the working classes sort of like being separated. There's that fracture, and what the point we've got there is that the middle classes and the upper classes are the forces of nationalism. They identify, they support this new Germany, and the working labouring classes are increasingly internationalist because they are socialist. Okay, and that was very much represented in terms of the outcomes, in terms of the elections. And as you can see, because the working classes were the largest group, increasingly being alienated, their representation was very low, only tiny, about 9% of the vote in 1887. See how small the SPD were. By 1898, the SPD have achieved sort of nearly 60% of the vote, and they have become effectively the second largest party in the Reichstag, and eventually in 1912 they became the largest party in the Reichstag. So there's the sort of diagram that sort of like captures the social fracturing, the social divisions, and how those tensions translated into Reichstag elections. So we're now on to the mind map. Okay, all that is background. Okay, so in terms of context, in a nutshell, so by the end of the 19th century, German society was deeply fractured, with significant divisions and tensions between the different social classes. A key cause was the rapid expansion of an industrial working class, who were given a political voice and influence in the Reichstag through their party, the SPD, the Social Democratic Party. Okay, SPD. Remember, in German, it's Social Partei Demokratik. That's what it stands for. And the rapid growth of that party, as we saw, it went from being the small party in 1887 to being the second largest in a fairly short time, and became the largest in 1912. And I think it's about that rapid growth caused fear amongst all the groups that stood above the working classes in the social pyramid. All the groups, the artisans, the white-collar workers, the industrial elites, and of course the upper classes. And as a result, the middle classes became increasingly bound to work with the upper class elites. And that cooperation, okay, the cooperation of the white-collar workers working with the industrial elites, who worked with the rich farmers, the junkers, the upper classes, that cooperation was a distinct German phenomenon, okay, called the Alliance of Steel and Rye. And that's very, very different from other industrialised countries. If you looked at Britain, who experienced a similar industrialisation process, actually the middle classes challenged the upper classes for political power. Okay, they actually challenged them. There was fierce competition between the middle classes and the upper classes. But what happened in Germany is the middle classes and the upper classes allied together. They became a team. And why was that different in Germany? Because the main reason for that is at the bottom of the social pyramid, you've got what industrialisation did in Germany is it caused the rapid rise of the working classes. And that's the key thing. In Britain, the working classes grew gradually over many, many decades, whereas in Germany, because industrialisation happened late and Germany had to rapidly catch up with industrialisation was so quick that it led to the sudden rapid appearance of a working class, literally in a few years. And because of that sudden appearance of the working class, then that created fear amongst the middle and upper classes in Germany, who then rallied together, concentrated themselves, cooperated into the alliance of steel and Reich. So there's just a reminder of the social classes. So again, we covered this in our original lesson a couple of months ago. So that's the social group that's rising rapidly then are the urban working classes. And because they appeared so rapidly in Germany, it caused these groups in particular, the white-collar workers, the industrial new elites, and the landed nobility, to concentrate together. And you've got then that fracturing in the middle of German society. The artisans were the alienated group that felt threatened in all directions. So there we have it, okay. The social tensions diagram. So you've got the expanding working classes had genuine power through the phenomenally rapid growth of the SPD and the Reichstag. And that was a threat to the groups here. So the industrial elites and the Junkers felt threatened by that word, rapid rise of the urban working classes. And as a result, the elites needed the support of the parties in the Reichstag that represented the middle classes, e.g. the Centre Party and so on. So these groups at the top, therefore, said, we need your backing against these groups at the bottom. And so there was an alignment there, a coming together of the elites and the professional middle classes sort of coming together. In a sense that maybe the diagram is not completely accurate, because the Mittelstand didn't really, I should probably have separated that out and say they didn't really sort of fit into normal politics. Okay, so there's that sort of summary of the fracturing that we're talking about. Okay, so and then you've got the rise of the Social Democrats. Okay, so there I've represented the fact that in a sense, what we're doing here is we've taken our sort of social pyramid and turned it sideways on. Sorry, just pull my pen up and draw that. So imagine our social pyramid turned sideways on. So the working classes at the bottom are left wing, and then the right wing are the middle classes, and the upper classes are the right wing forces, and they're sort of represented here. So the workers on the left of politics support socialism, which is international. So there's internationalism represented by the SPD. And in 1887, the forces of internationalism, the forces of socialism, are relatively weak. And of course, that's in the context of German unification is fairly recent, and there's a great deal of support for nationalism. But as industrialization progresses, sort of just 11 years later, by 1898, the SPD have grown to become the second largest party in the Reichstag. So the forces of socialism and internationalism are getting stronger and stronger inside the Reichstag. So it's increasingly difficult to pass laws. As long as the SPD is growing, it's going to be difficult. Because remember, the party of the ruling elites are the German conservatives. So they became increasingly dependent on the Centre Party to be able to pass laws. So again, this is all recap of things that we've already covered. Okay, so that's our sort of first strand, the context. Okay, so we're now going to get into the sort of details of the Kaiser. So we've got sort of 20 minutes to go, and hopefully we can cover this sort of topic of motivations in the final section of this lesson. So the influences and the purpose of the Navy building program. What was it all about? Okay, so I've just sort of put, I mean, if we've been in class, I'd have given you a moment just to sort of think about those questions. What did Kaiser Wilhelm II mean when he spoke of a place in the sun? And what personally motivated the young Kaiser Wilhelm II to pursue a place in the sun? And what were the political advantages for the middle and upper classes in supporting this policy, which was also called Weltpolitik or world policy? And how would Bismarck have felt about this policy? And of course, there's a very famous speech where the phrase place in the sun, a speech by the Kaiser where this phrase place in the sun, world policy, comes from. So what was all this about? So in a nutshell, okay, so we go back to Bismarck. Now Bismarck, I know, is gone, but let's just remind ourselves, we did this in the wait and see crisis. Bismarck's foreign policy had been to turn Germany into, remember, a European power, not a world power, but a European, a continental power. And for that reason, Bismarck had strongly believed that Germany, this new German empire, should not really get involved in global affairs. In other words, affairs beyond Europe. Okay. Now, other European countries were all basically scrambling for colonies, in particular in Africa, but also on the other side of the world, near China and in sort of Indonesia, the Philippines area. The other European countries, even little old Belgium, a very small European country, had a huge colony in Africa called the Congo. But Bismarck had always said to Kaiser Wilhelm I, his main boss, I suppose, in a sense, look, we're a new country, let's not get involved in any of that, okay? And logically, he said, well, the main reason is actually we are mainly a landlocked country. Why, if we're going to get involved in the race for land abroad, we would need to develop a navy, okay? But a navy is the kind of army on the seas, but it's very difficult for us to get our boats out to the seas because we've only got a very narrow coastline in the north. And so let's not bother. We are a European power. We need to focus on an army for the land. Creating a navy is actually going to create problems because, in a sense, it will bring us into conflict with countries like Britain, who've got a natural right to say, well, we should be controlling the international waters of the world. So that was really Bismarck's sort of main point. We mustn't get involved in global affairs. We're a landlocked country, mainly landlocked. Our interests should be in our own back garden in Europe. But the problem is, after Bismarck resigned in 1890, you've got this new, very young, 29-year-old Kaiser Wilhelm II. And Kaiser Wilhelm II had a fundamentally different approach. He believed that Germany should become a global power, and therefore, as a result, if Germany, this new country of Germany, is going to join the ranks of Britain and France and even little old Belgium, then Germany needs to basically join in the scramble for territory in places like Africa and around the world. In other words, Germany should have a place in the sun. That's the phrase the Kaiser gave this speech. So when he spoke of the place in the sun, obviously Africa is a very warm continent, so that's what he was basically referring to. Because it's all about Germany becoming a great power, a world power. So that's fundamentally different from Bismarck. And again, although it wasn't the specific reason why Bismarck resigned, there's almost that sort of feeling that if Bismarck hadn't resigned over the socialist issue, he would almost certainly have come into loggerheads with the Kaiser over this foreign policy issue. So we have to ask ourselves, what motivated the Kaiser to take such a different approach to that of Bismarck and his grandfather, the Kaiser Wilhelm I, who hadn't really been interested in any of this. Okay, so central to this new policy was the need for Germany, as a mainly landlocked European country, to build a large navy. Okay, because if you're going to become a world power, you've got to get out onto the international seas. It's the only way to get your armies to travel. So you need to have a large navy. You need to have another branch to your armed forces. You can't just have an army, you now have to have a navy. And so what basically happened is the Kaiser introduced a navy building program. Okay, so the government backed the creation of navy building. And for various reasons that we'll look at, it arguably was successful. It captured the nationalist imagination, and in particular the German middle classes really loved it. They agreed with the Kaiser. Okay, and part of the reason for that comes down to this fear of the socialists. Okay, because the middle classes hoped that if Germany got involved in a race for colonies, like a competition, we're competing against the British and against the Belgians and the Portuguese and the Spanish, etc. We're competing to grab as much land of our own, it's almost like an international World Cup, sort of in term, but it's not football, it's the race for colonies, that the German working classes will get hooked up in it and will get suddenly interested and will suddenly get really proud of their being German. And so effectively the lower classes will forget that they're unhappy, will forget that they, the bread prices are high and that they've got appalling living conditions, and they will forget that their enemies are the German factory owners, etc. And instead they'll suddenly get caught up behind, well, we're really proud to be German because we're winning the race for colonies, and they'll forget that. Okay, so distract them away from dangerous socialist and international ideas and create much greater national unity. And I've already sort of made that reference in a previous lesson, how you do sometimes see that even in modern politics, that I mentioned in Britain in 1981. There was a great deal of discontent amongst the British lower classes. There were community tensions and riots in British cities in 1981 because of social deprivation, and the working classes were turning against the rich, the middle classes, and that really worried the British government. And then suddenly in 1982, Britain went to war against Argentina for the Falklands Islands, and bingo, in many ways, the British working classes suddenly were very proud to be Britain. And so by going to war, it created national unity. Okay. Now, not saying that was deliberate, don't want to get into modern politics, but a lot of people at the time and commentators at the time were quite cynical about the motivations of the British government. Was that something that was deliberately done as a way of creating unity at a time when there was an increasing division and fracturing within British society? So in a sense, it's a similar thing that we're talking about here. Was the Kaiser pursuing this new adventurous global policy as a way of healing the divisions within Germany and creating a greater sense of national unity? Okay, so here's the famous speech. Now you'll need to pause the screen, and it's on your handout anyway, but it's worthwhile reading that speech, A Place in the Sun speech. And I put a couple of a question there. I put, which line in this speech is the best evidence that Kaiser Wilhelm II hoped his world policy would lead to national pride and unity? So read the speech and pause the video and see if you can work out which line from that speech would you actually want to pull out that line, put it in your notes, and then memorize that line, and then you could use that line in an essay. Okay, as evidence that one of the motivators for his world policy was exactly this. Okay, it was to create national unity, to get people to forget their differences. Just pause and have a look at it. Okay, so the bit for me, it's this bit here in the middle. For when the German has once learned to direct his glance upon what is distant and great, the pettiness which surrounds him in daily life on all sides will disappear. So in other words, your average ordinary working class German who's struggling to get on, and food prices are high, and you're grumbling and you don't like the boss, and etc. Suddenly all those little things will disappear, and you'll suddenly become proud to be German, because Germany is competing on the international stage for colonies. references the Hanseatic League. That's an old medieval league of German merchants, but it just gave me an opportunity to put that map. But as you can see, in terms of where Germany has got a coastline in the north, but actually most of her coastline, it's very, very difficult for Germany to get onto the international waters. Much of her coastline was on the Baltic Sea, and you can get your boats into this sea, but to actually get them out into the international waters, you've got to sort of like get through around this bit here, I'll just sort of mark it on, and sort of round here into the North Sea, and then you've got to basically go up around Britain, or again, the British won't be very happy about you getting into their waters through the English Channel. In a sense, is it worth it? Okay, because you're not really a seafaring power. Germany is a continental power. That has always been the issue with Germany's geographical location. So if we're going to understand the motivations, it was largely driven by the personality of the Kaiser. He was obsessed with turning Germany into the world's dominant power. Why was that? Well, he was very influenced by nationalist ideas that Germany needed to compete internationally to reflect, because Germany was a growing industrial power, and to reflect Germany's economic and its military strength, it needed to assert its power around the globe. That's the point that's being made there. And he dreamed in particular of Germany rivaling Britain and France as a colonial power. So the main area for competition was there in Africa. And as you can see, the French in green had huge swathes of colonies in Africa. The British in pink, again, huge swathes, Egypt, Sudan, many from north to south. And even Belgium had a great big colony there. The Portuguese had colonies. And Belgium and Portugal in particular, and also Britain and France, Germany had overtaken them in terms of being a leader in Europe, a great power in Europe, and yet Germany was not really involved. So as you can see, Germany entered the race late and achieved territories in the Cameroons and East Africa and in West Africa, but that is really sort of like the sort of story here that we're talking about. Okay, so this was a significant break from everything Bismarck had believed. Okay, which is our next point. Bismarck had been very anxious to avoid colonial conflict. Germany's relations with Britain had recently been tested over conflicts in Africa. There had been conflicts in Africa between Britain and Germany, and as I say, in particular, without getting into sort of the details of it, the first sort of venture into getting a colony was German Southwest Africa, and as you can see, that bordered the pink next to it was British colonies, and that created real tensions between Britain and Germany. And the Kaiser became convinced, well, if we ever end up in a war with Britain over these colonies, we need to have a strong navy, okay, to give us leverage in future conflicts. So that's the beginning of it. In 1888, the Kaiser restructured. Germany only had a very small navy, but the administrative apparatus was restructured to make it a more efficient organisation. In spite of that, by 1897, the German Navy was only the 7th largest in the world. And so we traditionally therefore see 1898 as the beginning of the big expansion of the German Navy, where the Kaiser is really making his statement that we need to have a big navy to become a world global power. So the Kaiser saw the building of the navy as a potential solution also to Germany's growing domestic political divide. So as we've seen, if you build a German navy, it will enthusiastically, a navy building program will be enthusiastically supported by significant sections of German society, and in particular the middle and the academic classes. So why is that? Well, it's going to provide a lot of jobs and contracts for German industry. If you're going to build a big navy, it's going to create a lot of contracts for German business, for industry in the cities. That is bound to help improve popular opinion at a time when, remember, food prices were rising because of Bismarck's protectionist policies. And the other ambition that the Kaiser had is that the navy would become, because it was new and Germany had never really had a navy before, it would become a sort of symbol of this new Germany, of we are a new country and a navy will symbolise the kind of hopes of the future, okay? And in contrast to the army, because the German army, which was the Prussian army, remember, was in a sense very elitist. It was very much an organisation of the upper classes. And so here's an opportunity that if we build a navy, that the navy can become like a middle class branch of the armed forces, okay? And so that will, in a sense, therefore, help bridge the divide that is dividing Germany. It will unite the different classes because we'll have a branch of the armed forces, the German Navy, that will give buy-in to the middle classes and also to the lower classes. And so that fracturing that was happening under Bismarck, in a sense, a navy building programme will help sort of like glue that all together again, because it'll be a new branch of the armed forces that the lower sections of the social pyramid will be able to identify better with. The Prussian army, as great as it was difficult for the lower classes to identify with it because it was very elitist. It was dominated by noblemen, whereas the navy is an opportunity to give jobs in the navy to the middle and even the lower classes. So that will be a way of pulling the country back together again. So that those are the points there. Okay. So if you go to Carr on page 173, there's a little bit from Carr about Weltpolitik. Okay. And there it is, that's where he says it there. He says world policy was a response to internal pressure, part economic, part psychological, part political. That he's saying, therefore, there was fracturing, there was division in Germany. And if you pursue world policy but with a navy building programme, it's a way of overcoming those divisions, okay, which is what Carr is talking about there. So what's then very good about Carr on page 173 is he then starts talking about the different motivations that lay behind it, unpicking that. And he says, firstly, one motivation is economic, okay? And again, pause and read. But what he's saying there is, if we've got colonies around the world, okay, it's going to give us raw materials to feed our new factories. But it's also going to give markets for our manufactured goods. So raw materials like cotton and silk, etc., will come from abroad into Germany. We'll use our factories to then manufacture goods, and we can then ship them back to our colonies to sell them. And that's going to basically create jobs, and it's going to increase wealth, accumulated capital. Capital is another word for wealth. Okay, so it's going to give us new markets. So all of that is going to basically help the German economy. So that's the sort of economic motivation or an economic reason for developing a navy and expanding Germany's influence by using the navy to grab colonies around the world. And then there's this really interesting one, okay, which when Carr says psychological reasons, psychological pressures, he is talking about something very interesting, something that we call social Darwinism, okay? Now, we'll talk about this a lot more when we get on to Hitler and the Third Reich. But this idea here, and again, you can pause and just read this extract from Carr, is it talks about the biological ideas of someone called Lamarck, who's not important, and Darwin. Now, you hopefully will know about Charles Darwin from your science lessons at GCSE. And of course, the 19th century was a great period of scientific improvement, and one of the great new developments of the 19th century was the ideas of Charles Darwin, who basically looked at animal species and developed the theory of evolution, the concept of natural selection. And of course, the the theory of natural selection is the idea that species will evolve over thousands, even millions of years, and gradually they will adapt to their environment, so that the law of the jungle is tough, and that for species to survive they have to biologically adapt to be stronger in order to survive, and the species that cannot biologically adapt simply will not be able to live. It's a tough world. It's the law of the jungle. That's what the animal kingdom is. Now, what happened in the 19th century is you've got, in a sense, a struggle, a competition on a global scale between the European countries for colonies. So there is a scramble between Britain v France v Portugal v Belgium, and now Germany getting involved for colonies in Africa. And that struggle, when countries struggle against each other, is inevitably going to create tensions that could overspill into war. And what the social Darwinists basically said, well, hold it, in a sense, the relationship between countries, the struggle between countries, in a sense, is very similar to the struggle between animals in the jungle. And that in the law of nature, according to Darwinism, struggle is good because the strong will win and the weak will go under. Okay, and that's simply the way it is. So social Darwinists were people who latched onto these ideas and said, well, therefore, actually, war is good. Conflict between nations, an unceasing struggle between nations where the right of the strongest is law. That conflict and war is good because it will weed out the weak nations, and the strong nations have the right to grab land off each other. Okay, now this was a very minority point of view. Okay, but nevertheless it was a point of view that was increasingly being written down and was starting to be read about. And there is evidence that Kaiser Wilhelm II would have been aware of these ideas. So that is an influence on this new young Kaiser, okay, as to why he wanted to pursue this struggle. And of course it wouldn't have been just the Kaiser. Many of his advisors and many of the German businessmen would have sort of like echoed these ideas and said yes, okay. And so that was what we mean when we talk about the psychological pressures that were sort of pulling Germany into the direction of joining in the struggle for colonies. The sort of argument, well, if we don't join in the struggle, then Germany could go under. It's a tough world. We've got to basically join in that struggle, and we've got to fight to win that struggle. Okay. So the next one is political pressures. Okay, so by the end of the century, and again you can read that, pause that, but I think we've pretty much covered that already. But of course, the argument here with the political pressures, as we've seen, is Bismarck. Bismarck, who's now out of office, but he had been able to rely on the National Liberals to pass laws. But now the National Liberals have fallen into decline. And so to pass laws, the new Kaiser, to pass laws through the Reichstag, has got to look at other political groups. And it's increasingly difficult now to pass laws through the Reichstag, okay, because increasingly the SPD are the growing major party in the Reichstag, and the SPD are never going to vote for the laws that the Kaiser wants to pass. So in a sense, what the Kaiser now has to do is he has got to distract the workers away from socialism and get them to sort of like unite and vote for the parties of the right wing. And the best way to do that is to get them to sort of think in a different way. So it's about diverting attention away from the socialist threat at home and getting them to identify with Germany. And this is what we call sort of social imperialism and so on. Okay, so that's what Carr is talking about there. Okay, so there are motivations: political, psychological, economic, and of course the personality of the Kaiser. And I'll pause at that point. My phone has just told me a couple of minutes ago that we've now passed the hour mark. So that's as far as I wanted to go in this first lesson. And then in the next lesson, we will look at the Navy League and the consequences of the naval building programme that the Kaiser actually followed. Thanks very much for this. Hopefully you found that interesting and useful. Any questions, any aspects of it, if you're not sure, don't hesitate to send me a message on Teams. Thanks very much.